All right, a couple of preliminaries before we start into the rest of our material. I've had a couple of questions about books. I guess you guys really love books, which is, I think, great. And so I have my four recommendations for reading. For your initial introduction into apologetics, Mere Christianity is without parallel. I would recommend it in a heartbeat to a non-Christian or to any Christian who is interested in understanding their faith and defending it. And C.S. Lewis, the author, is very good. That book is available. I think the first three books are available up above. Francis Schaeffer Trilogy, a little bit harder, but worthwhile in understanding 20th century mindset. It's very good. I read it as a new Christian, and it has a tremendous influence in my understanding of defending the faith. Finally, if you want a book that deals with a lot of different topics that come up, the resurrection, the authority of the Bible, the problem of evil, the existence of God, J.P. Moreland's Scaling the Secular City is a wonderful book. It's rigorous, but that's why I recommend it. It's very, very thoroughgoing and tough, and that's what makes it good. I would also recommend a book that you can't get yet. It'll be out in about a month. It's called Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair, published by Baker Bookhouse, authored by Beckwith and Koukl. So if you would like to get a copy of our book, though, we have a little sign-up that's down below. You see this little thing. It says Relativism on it. Please send me a book. If you purchase it here, we'll send you an autographed copy by Dr. Moreland, or rather by Dr. Beckwith and myself. Also, some of you might have picked up our little packet. This is what was referred to earlier. As you go down the stairs on the left and right, you'll see some of these. Most of it's standard reason propaganda, but it's worthwhile. It talks about our website at str.org on the World Wide Web. More than 300 pieces that I've done on the radio you can download absolutely free of charge. There's a whole bunch of other stuff there, too. It's worth going to. We have 10 to 20,000 commentaries a month that are downloaded by people all over the world, so it's a very popular site. You also can get a copy of the Solid Ground. It's our Standard Reason bi-monthly newsletter for free. We'll send it to you. We just need to know where you live, and that's what this little thing in here is all about. Give us your name and address. Give this to me or to the gal down who's taking care of the product, and we'll be sure and send you Solid Ground. This copy is free, of course, and you can pick one up. It deals with the problem of the age of the universe, this article. And I talk about the problems of starlight and how people have tried to solve the problems and whether those explanations work or not. So you're welcome to grab that as you go down. Also, just a word about the products down there. If you get tapes for Standard Reason, and we have a limited supply down there, but if you get tapes, you get my notes with it. And it isn't this variety, fill-in-the-blanks business. They are my lecture notes. So, for example, the tape on moral relativism for $7 also has about 25 pages of my whole lecture outline. And that's there for your training, so I just wanted to draw some attention to that. Tonight we'll have a question and answer session. You call it open forum or something like that? What time is that session? Does anybody know? 6. I'm really looking forward to that. I had a number of people came up and asked particular questions about this material or about the broad area of defending the faith. It's going to be wide open this evening, so if you have any questions, please come, and I'll stay as long as you guys want to stay. I mean, you can have the evening as far as I'm concerned. I'm here to meet with you guys. So that generally is a very vigorous and energetic session, and all questions are allowed. I ended the last session talking about the idea that subjectivism in religious claims has now expanded to take up virtually all truth claims. One thing I forgot to mention, and I just want to emphasize it because it may be on the test for those of you who are taking the test, is the subjectivism with regards to religion, the view that religion is really about tastes and preferences, has led to dealing with religion kind of as a placebo. You know what a placebo is? Placebo is a little pill that you take when you think you're sick but you're not, and it's just a little sugar pill. It doesn't do anything, but psychologically it makes you feel better. And when one takes the view that religions are really an expression of personal tastes, it's treating religion as if it were a placebo. as if it was just something to make you feel better. And different people have different tastes and preferences, so different religions make them feel good about themselves. And as I mentioned last hour, my interest is not in making anyone feel better, including myself. That's not my principal interest. My principal interest is knowing what's true about religion. And if it turns out that no religion is true because there's nothing out there, by golly, I want to know that. But if there are some religious truths that pertain to me and have significant consequence in my life, indeed have eternal consequence, which is the Christian claim, then by golly, we ought to know this, because now we're not talking about insulin, thinking something that could save your physical life. We're talking about something that could save your eternal life. The view that is current now that all truth is like ice cream is called postmodernism. Postmodernism, it's a term you may have heard, you may not have heard, but I'm sure that you felt its impact, especially if you're in the academy, in the university. It's the view, basically, that all truth is relative. Not just religious truth, not just moral truth, but everything. There are no particular truth claims that are objectively true. That all supposed truth claims are functions of interpretive environments, the language that you speak, the communities that you're in, everything is subjective. Postmodernism holds that there is no predefined objective rationality, that there is no way to adjudicate between issues, that the idea that if a thing is true, that its contradiction must be false, the law of non-contradiction, is just a Western make-me-up. It's what we in the West think of. We use this because it's the way we do business. It's a function of our interpretive community, but it is not a function, say, of Eastern communities, because they live with contradiction. Everything is simply a matter of personal preference, and this has bred a radical skepticism in every single area. And we've lost the confidence that statements of fact can ever be anything more than just opinions, that anything is certain beyond our subjective preferences. Now, I want to make a caveat here. The first caveat is that I'm giving a kind of a simplified explanation of postmodernism. There are much more sophisticated ways to explain this, and philosophers and professors go into a lot of detail about it. My personal feeling is that it's a tempest in a teapot. It all boils down to something very simple, and that what it boils down to is not worthy of much intellectual attention. I mean, I have a lot of disdain for this. It bugs me that I even have to talk about it, because it's so silly, quite frankly. Though I think the ideas are silly, I take the idea seriously because a lot of people do hold it seriously. And I think that the problems with postmodernism are very obvious and very self-evident. And I'll talk about some of those in just a moment. But, so the first caveat is that I'm just giving you a little overview, but I think really it turns out to be adequate. The second caveat, I can't remember what it is. I just forgot it. So maybe in a little while I'll think of it and I'll say it. But what's important about this radical skepticism is, oh, I remember what the second caveat is. The second caveat is I don't think people really believe this. They talk about it, but they can't live this way, nor do they. And when I made a comment earlier about moral claims being objective claims, a young man came up and said, well, what about somebody who says that that claim is really a subjective claim, that moral statements and religious claims should be objective ones? And I said, well, the problem with that is he thinks that I'm wrong in making my claim. And I can only be wrong if I'm making an objective claim. So he must be treating my claim as an objective claim and not a subjective claim. Or, maybe to put it a little more simply, he's correcting me, therefore he thinks he's right. Which demonstrates that he doesn't believe that all beliefs are relative, because he would think that his belief then is relative. But he thinks he's right about it. Therefore, at least his belief is not just relative to human experience, but reflects how the world actually is. The Freedom of Our Day lamented, a graduate in Harvard at a commencement service, is the freedom to devote ourselves to any values we please on the mere condition that we do not believe them to be true. Students feel safer as doubters than as believers, and as perpetual seekers rather than eventual finders. Did you ever notice that, by the way? If you're in conversation with people, and I went to college in the late 60s and the early 70s, which really radically dates me. But we had the kind of conversations there that I'm sure people have nowadays. And when you express the idea that you are a seeker of truth, everybody applauded that. That was really great. You know, oh, you're one of us. We're seeking the truth. But if you ever said you found it, well, that's like bad news. Then you're narrow-minded and arrogant, and now they say, oh, you're bigoted, and they call you all kinds of names when you say that. Well, what this means then is that it's good to seek, but it's terrible to find. And then I ask myself the question, what's the point of seeking? If we can never hope to find that which we say we're seeking after, which then makes the claim to seeking truth actually disingenuous. In any event, postmodernism holds to this radical relativism, the radical subjectivism. There is no predefined objective rationality. There are no arguments, essentially, if that's the case. And what makes this really hard for a guy like me is, it used to be that you could go out and contend for the Christian worldview. Now they've taken all the rules away. Even to say that the Christian worldview is true is nonsense to them. Nor do you have any tools left, on their view, to try to contend for that view. All the rules of rationality, all the tools of rationality don't count anymore. Now, there are reasons that people believe this. And one of the reasons is that it is the case that our culture influences tremendously how we think about things. And there are limitations to reasons. But these reasons are taken, for postmodernism, are taken to an extreme. And these views have ramifications. And what I'd like to do now is I want to make a short case for rationality, if I could put it in those terms. And I want to take the time to do that because I know that you're going to run into this. And people are going to cut your feet right out from underneath you by saying to you, these rules don't even count in the discussion, so you can't use them to play the game in contending for truth. I don't believe it is the case that all truth is relative. In fact, I think it's impossible for it to be the case that all truth is relative. And what I want to do is make a case for my notion that there are truth claims, and it's possible, at least in principle, to discover them. But before we do that, we have to define something. We have to define one word. What do you think it is? Truth. What is truth? Famous question of Pontius Pilate to Jesus. What is truth? And there seems to be a lot of confusion about this when you talk with people. And I don't think the confusion is justified because the definition of truth is very simple. And all of us know what it means. But when we get in these kinds of discussions, people suddenly talk as if truth is this thing that's completely out of reach. When somebody asks you, what is truth? You ask them this question. Do you know what a lie is? How many people know what a lie is? I mean, know what it is. You may not always recognize when it comes along, but you know what it is. Truth is just the opposite. Isn't that simple? Truth is just the opposite. If you know what a lie is, a statement that does not comport with the real world, truth is just the opposite. A statement that does comport with the real world. Your belief, your statement, corresponds to the facts of the world. If I say grass is green, and it is green, then my belief is what? True. What's so hard about that? If I say it's green and it's not, it's really red or brown, well, then my statement is false. This is the ordinary garden variety definition of the word truth. Very straightforward. Philosophers have a fancy word for it. They call it truth as correspondence. In other words, your statement corresponds to the way the world really is. But it's what we always mean by the word truth, unless we're in a philosophic discussion about religious and moral issues and postmodernism, and then we pretend like nobody knows what this word means. Truth as correspondence. When you say, son, are you telling the truth? you are expressing the definition of this particular word. You might even use the term objective truth, descriptive truth, because it accurately describes the way things really are. And if anybody gives you a hard time about this, just say, give them an illustration. You say, my red Porsche is in the garage. Now, what does it take for that statement to be true? That there's a red Porsche in the garage and you own it. In my case, the statement is false, but real simple, very straightforward. It means that your statements match some actual reality in the objective world. Now, in order for that to be the case, in order for there to be truth like that, there must be some actual conditions in the real world, right? There must be something in the world. Now, I agree that there is ambiguity in some cases about knowing truth about the world. Like we might say, how many people are in this room? Well, we could count them, and that would be one way of finding that out. But there are other things that maybe are a little more difficult to find out. It is clear to me that there are problems about knowing particular things. But it is equally clear to me that there are particular things to know. And as long as there is any state of affairs in the world, and when I say the world, I mean the world in its largest sense, everything that exists, if there is any particular state of affairs, there are facts pertaining to that state of affairs. And if there are facts pertaining to a state of affairs, there are, at least in principle, statements that express those facts, right? And if the statements express facts that correspond with the state of affairs, we call those statements true. Are you with me? Let's just say nothing exists except for this tape. That's it. Okay? Would the statement, nothing exists but this tape, be then a true statement? Of course it would. As long as there is anything, there is a statement that will reflect something about that, and therefore you have a statement that corresponds with reality, therefore you have an objective truth. Back in, I think, the 17th or 17th century, a man climbed into an oven because it was warm. It was a big oven, you know. He wasn't roasting himself, he was just finding a warm place, and he started to think. And he said, you know, maybe nothing exists. Maybe all of these things I perceive are all false. Maybe I'm not getting it. Maybe I'm just being misled. Maybe I'm being deceived by a demon. And he started thinking about it. He said, yeah, I could be deceived about everything except for one thing I can't be deceived about. I can't be deceived about my thoughts about possibly being deceived. I may doubt everything, but I can't doubt the fact that I'm doubting. Okay? And in fact, that would apply to any thought. If I think about anything, then there must be someone who's doing the thinking. And he wrote down this little thing in Latin. He said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And René Descartes was making a very simple observation, that if there are any thinking minds to think about anything, then something must exist to think about, even if it's one's own mind. And if only one's own mind is the only thing that exists, then there is a state of affairs about the world, there are facts that pertaining to that state of affairs, and there are statements that could conceivably reflect accurately that state of affairs. Therefore, the statement there is no truth is false if anything exists. If only one single thing exists, the statement that there is no truth is false. And indeed, it turns out to be self-refuting because the statement there is no truth is believed by postmodernists to be, guess what? True. Now, they think you're playing a game when you say that, because what you are using then is Western logic. You are using what's called the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same way. If you say a thing is white, it can't be not white. at the same time and in the same, using the words in the same way. Napoleon, you might say, is a big man, and he's not a big man. Well, that sounds like a contradiction. Unless you mean that he is big in history but small in physical stature. There's no contradiction there. But the foundational rule of Western rationality, I'm putting Western in quotations here, because I don't really think it's Western, is that a thing and its contradiction can't both be true at the same time. But when you start using those rules to disprove postmodernism, postmodernists say, well, wait a minute, we don't accept those rules. We don't live by those rules. Therefore, you can't use them against them. So when you say, well, you say this is true, that there is no truth, that's an obvious contradiction. It doesn't make any difference to them. Now, the tactic that I want you to pursue at this particular point is I want to show you how it is the case that even postmodernists actually believe in these rules, and they use them all the time. And I want to show you that these rules are not Western conventions. They aren't things that we just made up. Like we decide to sit around a table in a certain way and eat with knives and forks and spoons. Manners, those are conventions. If we changed our mind and decided to sit on the floor like they do in Southeast Asia and eat, or eat with our hands like they do in India, well, we could change that convention. You see, their view is that rationality is one of those kinds of things. It does strike me as rather odd because it's hard for me to imagine how we could simply change the rules of logic. But anyway, that's what they hold. But I contend they don't really believe it. And see, this is a great ally that you have on your side. And I want you to keep this in mind regardless of what you're dealing with. The tremendous ally that you as Christians have on your side, if you have an accurate and balanced Christian worldview, is that your view is true. And it's a lot easier to contend for the truth than it is to contend for something silly. And not only that, if a thing is deeply true, most people know it. And it is deeply true that there are truths in the world, and that postmodernism is a false view of the world. And even postmodernists know that. How do I know they know it? I was having a conversation. I was actually just before a radio show. I was having lunch, place in Orange County, sitting there by myself, and there was a group of people over here by the side. And they were talking about religion and stuff, and I was kind of listening in, and I really wanted to get in on the conversation. And so I invited myself over. Of course, these guys were like a little bit on the New Age side of things, so they're really accommodating. And I said, you have a question. You were talking about things that was really interesting to me. Sometimes though, it was confusing because you talked about God as if he were a person. And then other times you talked about him as if he were just some kind of non-personal force. And what I want to know is, in your view, is God personal or is he not personal? Now notice, according to the law of non-contradiction, he can't be both. He can't be personal and not a person at the same time in the same way. So I'm asking for a clarification. And the people looked at each other and smiled knowingly and nodded their head. Ah, yes. And it wasn't like I was enlightening them. Because when they said, well, he's both, to me, I said, well, that's contradictory. They went, oh, yeah, he's one of them. He's one of these Western-thinking guys. And they said, no, and very kindly and graciously, they explained to me that I really had it all wrong, that, you see, the truth is the kind of thing that is contradictory, and that God is both personal and impersonal at the same time. Now, I noticed something unusual about their statement, and maybe some of you have picked it up. We are discussing the question of religious truth, to which question they claim it is not appropriate to apply the laws of thinking. But how do they correct me? They say, I have one view, and their view is the opposite, the contradiction. Their view is correct, they contend, therefore what seems to be true about my view? My view must be wrong. This is their contention. This is their conversation. No, you're mistaken about your view. Our view is correct. And if our view is correct, your view can't be right. What were they doing? They were employing the law of non-contradiction to refute my use of the law of non-contradiction in religious questions. Aristotle pointed out, look, and if you say one thing is true, it means you deny the contradiction of that. You can't, whenever you correct somebody, you are employing the notion of contradiction. And so even people who hold postmodernism, and I point out to them that their point of view is contradictory. They say there is no truth, and they think that statement is true, and they want to just brush me off because we're applying Western morality. In the very process of, Western rationality, in the very process of their rebuke of me, they're employing this kind of rationality, which must be employed to say anything intelligent about the situation at all. And it just turns out to be false that the East has a different rationality. You know how I know? Because I own a Japanese computer. Now think about that for a minute. If it were the case that people in other cultures and in other parts of the globe have really a different rationality, math wouldn't work. And if math doesn't work, computers don't work. Now there's a sense in which there are different sensibilities people have in different cultures. And if you go to, if you've had a chance to travel, I suspect some of you have. I've lived overseas. And you realize that when you're with other people in other cultures that they act and think differently. There's a sense in which they think differently. And the conflict that we experience with that is called culture shock. But see, we're not talking about just sensibilities, whether you sit down at the table or you sit on the floor to eat, things like that. We're talking about at the root. The claim of postmodernism is that the fundamental laws of rationality don't apply. Now, they must apply or else the computers wouldn't work. But further than that, I want to make an observation about the law of non-contradiction. What the law of non-contradiction says is that a thing, if one thing is true, it is distinguished from everything that it is not. Okay? So when I say, get the chair, it is not the case that I mean get everything else that's not the chair. I mean something in particular, and I can say that because of the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction allows me to distinguish a given thing from everything else that it's not, which means that the law of identity, that a thing is itself and not something else, is tied in with the law of non-contradiction. What would happen if the law of non-contradiction just didn't happen to apply in this culture, as some people claim? Well, when I asked you for the chair, you could get me anything else, because a chair would not be distinguished from everything that it is not. Are you with me on that one? What this means is that if you have a culture in which the law of non-contradiction doesn't actually operate, you could never talk to them. Nor could they talk to each other, because they wouldn't know what they were talking about. Because the law of non-contradiction would not actually be functioning to distinguish one word or one thing from something else. And so when people tell me, well, Eastern cultures don't have that rationality, I say, how do you know that? Did they tell you that? If they told you that, they had to employ the law of non-contradiction. If they talk to each other, they are subconsciously employing this rule. They don't know what it's the name of it, but we do it all the time. The law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, we do it all the time. We don't know the fancy words, but we live by it because it's part of the nature of the universe and it's built in to our mental structures. And even animals do this when they distinguish between particular things. Now, some people point to the use of Zen Buddhist koans, K-O-A-N-S, as evidence that people in the East don't use Western rationality. They say, yeah, you've probably heard about the famous Zen koan called the sound of one hand clapping. Heard of that one? Now, I'm a fisherman, and I like bass fishing, actually. And so I wanted to do a cartoon of how big was the fish that the Zen Buddhists caught. It was this big. Kind of an inside joke. Anyway, just a bit of humor. It's not much. But The sound of one hand clapping is a Zen cone, and you can see that it's an absurd concept because you can't clap with one hand, and therefore one hand doesn't make a sound. The idea of Zen cones is that you meditate on this incoherent statement, and this helps you to transcend to a deeper level of reality in which contradictions exist. But there's one thing interesting about a Zen cone. It is practiced by Buddhists. And where does Buddhism start? Anybody know where it started? Buddhism started in India and spread eastward from there, and then northward. And then only recently did it get transplanted in this country with any force. The people who have to use Zen cones, who have traditionally used them, are people in the East. Now, if it is in fact the case that Western logic is simply a function of the West, and Easterners don't think like this, then why do Zen masters have to give Zen cones to Buddhist disciples who are members of an Eastern culture to shock them out of their Western rationality when they don't use Western rationality? You see, they use it automatically because it's not Western, it's human. It's a feature of the world that we all participate in. And even Easterners, Buddhists, have to be jarred out of their dependence upon it. They have to be somehow persuaded or convinced that it simply does not apply. Well, I think that's good evidence that it does apply, and that most of us got it right when we apply these concepts. And this brings us to what I call the trouble with the elephant. And many of you are aware of this Eastern, what do we call it, a kind of a parable, I guess, of the 7 blind men and the elephant. Remember how the story goes? The blind men go into the big city for the first time, and it's the first time they encounter an elephant, and they're all touching it at different places, and one pulls on the tail and says, oh, the elephant's kind of like a rope. Now I understand. Another one's by his side, and he's touching the broad side of the elephant, and he says the elephant is like a wall. Another one, feeling around the leg, says the elephant really is like a pillar. A fourth one said, no, you're mistaken, and he's touching the tip of the tusk of the elephant. He says an elephant is actually like a spear. And they get in this big argument because each has a different point of view of what the elephant is actually like. The argument was so loud that it wakes up the Raja, who is in the palace, side of the square. He comes out onto the balcony and he says, shut up! The elephant is a big animal. You each got one part. Put it all together and you've got the whole thing. Now the parable is used in 2 different ways. It's most frequently used by devotees of Eastern religions who want to make the case that all religions are ultimately true and all religions lead to God. All roads lead to Rome. And they say that every religion has a little piece of it, the Christians, etc., the Jews, Buddhists, and you put them all together and you've got the real McCoy. There's some serious problems with seeing it in that way. Actually, the Hindu claim that all religions are equally true and lead to God is really disingenuous, because what they really mean is all religions lead to Hinduism, because Hinduism teaches that all the distinctions are just an illusion anyway, ultimately speaking. But in any event, the other way of applying it is the postmodern way. And the idea is, from a postmodern perspective, and this is really their point of view, that we are all locked inside of our own interpretive communities. We've been taught how to see reality, and so we can't see beyond that. And so we're all blind in this fashion, and so when we grasp at parts of reality, we get our own interpretation. The rope, the wall, the pillar, the spear. Now, what's interesting about this observation, and this is what I call the trouble with the elephant, is that illustration actually doesn't make their point of view. It refutes their point of view. How is it that the blind men know, subsequent to their discussion, that they each have only a part of the elephant and that their perception is limited to their own experience? How do they know this? Someone told them. Who told them? The Raja on the balcony. Now, how did the Raja know that they were making mistakes? Because he could see it all. Who said that? Get a star. He could see it all. The Raja was in a position of privileged access to the complete truth, and therefore he was in a position to correct people. But a postmodernist claim is that nobody is in the position of privileged access to the truth. Here's the irony. That claim is meant to be a privileged claim. I asked the postmodernist, in this illustration, which person are you? Are you one of the blind men, or are you the Raja? Now, this is an intractable problem for the postmodernist, by the way. Because if he says he's a blind man, well, then he's blind. How is it that he knows the truth of all reality if he is indeed blind? Well, the only way he could know is if somebody else told him. And so that's what I'm going to find out. Who told him the real truth of it? Now, if he's in the position of the Raja, my question is going to be different. How is it that you alone see and all the rest of us are blind, and you're the one that's informing us about the true nature of reality? You see, even the postmodernist is making what turns out to be an objective claim about the world. That's why postmodernism can't be true. It defeats itself. And the elephant illustration really does more for my side than anything else, because I'm willing to claim that, yes, there are limitations and there's a sense in which we're all blind to some degree, but it doesn't mean that we are so blind that we can't know anything for sure. But secondly, there is someone in a privileged position of truth, someone who sees all and has taken the time to communicate a significant portion about what he knows to us in the Bible. It turns out that that illustration really does more to express the Christian point of view than it does Eastern religion, and it certainly doesn't support postmodernism. So the biggest problem with postmodernism is that postmodernists think they're right. When people say that's your truth, they're really saying you believe something that's false. They don't mean it's your truth. They mean what you're stating is false in the big picture. They're correcting you. They're saying that's not the way it is. It's this other way. And once they say it's this other way, they can't be postmodernists anymore. Because they're identifying the way they think reality actually is. It's interesting, I had a conversation with actually I'm looking at my time. I don't have time to tell you that story. Let me just close this session with this thought. If postmodernism is true, in other words, if all views about everything turn out to be relative to the subject, then if there is no truth, guess what you don't have? Remember I asked you the definition? I zeroed in on the definition of truth, asking you if you knew what something else was. What was that? A lie. Guess what? If there is no truth, there are no lies. There can't be. The notion of a lie turns out to be incoherent. There can't be counterfactual circumstances because there's no factual circumstances. Everything is counterfactual in that regard. There's no difference between fantasy and reality. It's impossible to live in denial, because living in denial means that you are not facing up to what's actually true about a circumstance. There are no falsehoods. There is no deceit. No one can ever tell a lie. There is no capability of seeing things as they really are. Now, I want you to get a little feeling here in those statements as how radical such a view is, and how completely contrary to our intuitions about the nature of reality these statements are. If there are things such as untruths or lies, if there is such a thing as denial, if there is a difference between fantasy and reality, then postmodernism, as a view of the world, is false. And it must be so. And this is why I say there aren't really any postmodernists. There aren't any real radical relativists. The same is true of moral relativism. For those people who say, gee, there is no morality. It's all a matter of one's personal preference. How do I know that there are no real moral relativists? Because what they say right next. They say there is no morality, moral will is a relative, therefore you shouldn't what? push your morality on them. Well, think about that for a second. If there is no morality, then why shouldn't I push any view that I have on you? You see, they say there's no morality, and then they impose a moral rule on you. If there's no morality, there is no moral rule that says I ought not push my moral view on you. Which just goes to point out that people aren't really relativists. They talk with moral language all the time, and they talk as if there are some things true about the world, and it's possible for us to find those things out. Now, if that's true, and there are some things that are true about the world, and there's some, at least in principle, some possible ways for us to find those things out, then it might be helpful to give ourselves a little bit to the process itself and find out what the rules are and what the tools are, so that we can begin discovering what the truth is and, in a meaningful way, attempting at least to separate truth from error. And in our next session, we're going to talk about what an argument is, how to build an argument, and how arguments go wrong.